My name is Sienna Hargrove. I am 31 years old. I live in Melbourne, Australia. The night that changed everything started at the top of a marble staircase in a house that was never really mine. Before I take you back to that night, I want to say something to you directly. If you are watching this, thank you. Every like and every subscribe tells me that my story matters to someone out there. It pushes me to keep going. So if this speaks to you, please hit like and subscribe. It means more than you know. Now let me tell you what happened. It was 11:48 p.m. I was 7 months pregnant. My belly was round and heavy, and I had been careful on those stairs every night for months. I was walking back from the bathroom when I heard voices below. My mother-in-law, Margaret Hargrove, was speaking in a low and sharp voice. She said my name. Then she said something that froze me completely. She told my husband Lachlan that I was a problem that needed to be dealt with. I stood at the top of the stairs and held my breath. Then Margaret looked up. Her eyes found me in the dark. She did not look surprised. She looked decided. And she climbed the stairs fast. She reached the top in seconds. I had no time to step back. She raised both hands and shoved me with everything she had. Not a stumble. Not an accident. Both palms flat against my chest. I fell. The marble steps came at me one after the other. My arms shot out and caught nothing. I hit the bottom and lay there. The pain came sharp and then spread everywhere, and then disappeared completely. The worst part was the silence from inside me. For 7 months, my baby girl had moved. Little kicks, small turns, a nudge right under my ribs every evening like she was saying goodnight. After the fall, she went completely and totally still. Lachlan came running from the lounge. He saw me on the floor. He saw his mother standing at the top of the stairs. He looked between us for one long second. Then he asked me what I had done to cause it. Not Margaret. Me. The housekeeper, Bev, was the one who called the ambulance. Not my husband. Not the woman who had just pushed me down a marble staircase. Bev did it. I heard her voice on the phone from the floor, and I closed my eyes and I prayed with everything that I had left in me. The ambulance came quickly. The paramedics were kind. One of them held my hand the whole way and told me to keep breathing slowly. I kept asking about the baby. Nobody answered me directly for a long time. Lachlan did not ride with me. He stayed behind at the estate, with his mother. At Royal Melbourne Hospital, they took me straight through. The lights above moved fast as they wheeled me down the corridor. I counted them as something solid to hold on to. At 1:09 in the morning, a doctor sat beside my bed and told me in a quiet voice that my baby girl had not survived. She was gone. I had been carrying her for 7 months. I had already chosen her name. I had washed her tiny clothes and folded them in the drawer next to my side of the bed. My own mother arrived at 1:30. She had driven from Geelong in the dark without stopping once. She sat on the edge of my bed and held both my hands and said nothing for a long time. She simply stayed. That is what real love looks like. You stay. You do not ask what someone did to cause their own pain. You just stay beside them. Lachlan arrived at 6 a.m. He was not alone. A man in a gray suit walked beside him carrying a leather folder. A solicitor. My husband had brought a solicitor to the hospital on the morning after I lost our daughter. He did not bring flowers. He did not bring tears. He walked to my bedside and placed a white envelope on the table beside my water cup. He said, "I'm sorry it came to this." Then he turned and walked straight out before I could speak a single word. The solicitor gave me a small nod and followed him. Neither of them looked at the empty corner of the room where a crib should have been. I stared at the envelope for a while. My mom reached over and squeezed my hand. I opened it. Inside were divorce papers, already signed. His signature was dry and neat, like he had practiced it. I turned to the front page and looked at the date. Those papers had been signed 2 days before my fall. 2 days before. My hand stopped shaking then. Something very quiet moved through my chest and settled there. I read the date again slowly. And then I understood exactly what kind of man I had spent 3 years married to. Within 72 hours, Margaret had already spread her version of events all across Melbourne. She went to her tennis club on Thursday. She attended a charity lunch on Friday. She sent long messages to group chats I was never part of. In every version, I was the problem. I had been unstable throughout the pregnancy. The fall was my fault. The marriage had been troubled for years because of my behavior. She told it all with warmth and tears at the right moments. She was the picture of a concerned mother-in-law who had done nothing but try to help a difficult young woman. People believed her because she was convincing. She had spent decades learning how to perform the right emotion in the right room. I found out while still in my hospital bed. My cousin Priya sent me a screenshot from one of the group chats. I read Margaret's words sitting in a hospital gown, still sore from the fall, still hollow from the loss. I read every word carefully. Then I opened my phone and created a new folder in my photo gallery. I named it Evidence. I saved that screenshot first. Then I messaged Priya and asked her to send me everything she had received. 8 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Lachlan appeared in a Sydney newspaper. He was photographed at a property gala standing beside a woman named Brittany Caldwell. She was a wealthy developer's daughter, polished and certain of herself in the easy way of someone who has never once been made to feel small. 4 days after the photo, Lachlan announced their engagement on Instagram. It was a professional photograph taken at sunset. Brittany's ring caught the light perfectly. Lachlan looked relaxed, like a man with nothing heavy sitting in his past at all. I saw the post at 7 a.m. over a cup of tea at my kitchen table. I finished the tea. I washed the cup, dried it, and put it away in the cupboard. Then I sat back down and opened my laptop. I thought about who I had been before the Hargroves entered my life. I had been sharp and driven, and full of plans for myself. They had not removed that permanently. They had only buried it under 3 years of slow, steady pressure. I typed 3 words into the search bar: Master's Degree Finance. I pressed enter, and something that had been sleeping for a very long time woke up quietly inside me. Before the Hargroves, I had a life that was entirely my own. I graduated top of my finance class at the University of Melbourne. At 22, a paper I wrote on investment risk was published in an economics journal. At 23, a top Sydney firm offered me a graduate position. I was ready to take it. Then Margaret sat me down over tea and explained, softly and gently, that a good wife supports her husband's career first. She framed it like a gift. Lachlan nodded along. And I, who had never been made to feel that my ambitions were wrong before, turned the job down. Looking back, I can see how carefully I had been managed from the day I walked into that house. Margaret had spotted something in me that needed to go. My independence. My sharp edges. The part of me that pursued things and held her own in a room. She spent 3 years wearing that down. But pressure only changes the surface. The core does not move. Now, with nothing left to protect and no one left to shrink for, I re-enrolled. I studied with the quiet focus of someone who has already decided where this road ends. I end my 2nd week back at university. A woman sat in the back row of my Tuesday lecture. She wore a sharp navy blazer, and she did not take notes. She watched. Not the lecturer. Me. She was there again on Thursday. Then the following Tuesday. I noticed how her eyes tracked me whenever I answered a question or pushed back on something the professor said. She looked like someone making a quiet decision. After the 4th lecture, she approached me in the corridor. She said her name was Victoria Carr, founder of Pinnacle Capital, one of Melbourne's most respected private investment firms. She said she had read my published paper years ago and had never forgotten it. Then she offered me a junior analyst role on the spot. No formal process. Just a direct offer from a woman who knew her own mind. I said yes. I walked to the car park and immediately searched Pinnacle Capital on my phone before I even reached my car. I scrolled through their client portfolio. Halfway down the page, I stopped walking. Right there in the open car park, in the afternoon sun, I stood completely still. Hargrove Group was listed as a client. I sat in my car for a while before I drove home. I needed to think clearly before I moved. Pinnacle Capital worked with the Hargrove Group. If I took the role, I would be operating in the same professional world as the people who had taken everything from me. That was either the worst possible outcome or the most useful one. I decided it was the second. My first weeks at Pinnacle were quiet. I learned the systems, read the files, and matched the pace of the office. Victoria ran things with sharp expectations, and she got results from everyone around her. In week 3, she gave me a standard due diligence assignment, a financial review of a property group. I worked through it carefully. Then a different file crossed my desk. Routine analysis. Hargrove Group financial records. I opened it and began reading. What I found was not what the world saw when it looked at that name. From the outside, the Hargrove Group looked like an empire. From the inside, it was quietly falling apart. Failed contracts. Debt-propped properties. 2 subsidiaries bleeding money for over a year. 1 bad quarter from serious collapse. 3 months into my role at Pinnacle, Victoria placed a new acquisition folder on my desk. A company was seeking significant capital backing from Pinnacle. My job was to run a full financial analysis and produce a clear recommendation report. I opened the folder and turned to the cover page. It was a family photograph. Margaret stood in the center with her posture straight and composed, the way she always stood in rooms she controlled. Lachlan was beside her. Beside Lachlan stood Brittany, smiling easily. Behind all 3 of them was the glass front of Hargrove Group headquarters. The caption read, "A family with a vision for growth." Victoria had no knowledge of my history with these people. I had never mentioned Lachlan's name at Pinnacle. I had never mentioned the fall, the hospital, the divorce papers left beside a water cup. To her, I was simply the sharp analyst she had found in a lecture hall and trusted with important work. I looked at that photograph for a few seconds. Then I turned to page 2. At the top of a blank sheet, I wrote 1 word in clean letters. Analysis. I picked up my pen, and I began. I spent 2 weeks on that report. I arrived early every day and stayed past everyone else in the office. I worked through every document, every account, every liability, and every stated asset without exception. I did not soften a single number or round anything in the Hargroves' favor. I wrote exactly what the figures actually showed. The report exposed every weakness in the Hargrove Group structure. Hidden liabilities buried across subsidiary accounts. Inflated asset valuations that could not survive a standard audit. A credit line drawn at 92% with no repayment plan in sight. The conclusion was direct and clean. Pinnacle Capital should not invest unless the Hargroves surrendered significant operational control of their own company. It was the strongest work I had produced in my career. Not because I was angry, because I was precise. Good analysis does not require emotion. It simply states the truth without apology and lets the numbers speak for themselves. Victoria read the full report and called me into her office the following morning. She said it was the most honest document Pinnacle had received in 3 years. She asked if I was ready to present it to the acquisition board. I said yes. Margaret found out through her social network. Someone who knew someone at Pinnacle passed my name along. By the time it reached her, she had already decided the report was a deliberate personal attack. She called Lachlan that same evening. He called my office the next morning. I was at my desk reviewing a new file when his number appeared on my screen. I let it ring once, twice. On the 3rd ring I picked up. Pinnacle Capital, Sienna speaking. There was a pause. A beat too long. Then his voice came through, and the easy confidence he had always carried in rooms was not quite present. He stumbled over the first sentence. He tried to sound firm, but the steadiness kept slipping away from him. He said the report was biased and personal. He demanded a meeting to discuss it. I told him that any meeting regarding the Pinnacle report would be held at Pinnacle's offices at a time of my choosing, with the full documentation present on the table. He went quiet. When he finally spoke again, he sounded like a man trying to recall who used to hold the power in a room with me. I ended the call politely, booked the conference room for Thursday, and sent him a calendar invitation. Lachlan arrived on Thursday with 2 lawyers. He walked in with his shoulders back and chin lifted, the way he had always entered rooms, expecting them to rearrange around him. He opened a conference room door and found me already seated at the head of the table. The full report was in front of me. My notes were beside it. I was not nervous. I was not angry. I was simply present. He sat down. His lawyers flanked him. For 40 minutes, he tried to make the meeting personal. He used words like unfair and targeted. Every time he did, I redirected him to a specific page. The credit facility figures on page 14. The subsidiary losses on page 22. The asset valuations on page 31. He could not challenge the numbers because the numbers were correct and we both knew it. He left the room visibly rattled. I watched from the window as he crossed the car park. He stopped halfway and called someone. I could not hear the words, but I watched his shoulders drop forward. Later I was told he had said to someone that she was not the same person anymore. He was absolutely right. I was not. Lachlan had a younger sister named Pippa, 26 years old and quietly careful in the way of someone who had learned that staying small was the safest way to survive the Hargrove house. She had not been in contact since the divorce. I had assumed she had chosen her family's side, the way most people do when the pressure is applied. She reached out 3 weeks after the conference room meeting. A short message asking if we could meet somewhere quiet. We sat at a corner table in a small cafe in Fitzroy on a Wednesday afternoon. She arrived before me and had already chosen a seat with her back to the wall. She looked like she had not slept properly in a long time. When I sat down, she did not speak right away. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table. Then she slid an envelope across to me, without a word. Inside was a statutory declaration, witnessed by a justice of the peace, dated 4 months earlier. I read it carefully. All of it. It described exactly what Pippa had seen from the upstairs hallway at 11:48 p.m. on the night of my fall. Every detail, in writing, signed, and legally witnessed. Pippa told me that Margaret had known she witnessed the fall. The morning after, Margaret called Pippa into the sitting room and explained quietly what would happen if she ever spoke about what she had seen. She would be removed from the family will entirely. The funding for her small business would stop. She would be asked to leave the estate immediately. And the family would ensure that everyone in their social world understood that Pippa had suffered a breakdown and should not be trusted. Pippa was 22 years old at the time. She had no savings. Her business had barely started. She was frightened. So she said nothing, and she carried that silence for 4 years until the weight of it had grown heavier than her fear of speaking. I held the envelope and looked at her across the table. I did not hurry to fill the quiet between us. She looked up. Her eyes were red at the edges, but she was not crying. She simply looked relieved, the way people do when they finally set down something they have been holding far too long. I told her she was brave. She said she was just late. I told her late was not the same as never. I took Pippa's statement to a solicitor named Claire Ashworth. She was precise and still, and she listened to everything without interrupting once. When I finished, she opened a notepad and started writing straight away. She told me 2 separate legal paths were available. The first was a civil assault claim against Margaret, with Pippa's statutory declaration as the foundation evidence. The second was matrimonial financial fraud. The Hargrove family's former accountant, Dennis Webb, had already contacted Claire's office several weeks earlier. He had transaction records showing that in the 6 weeks before my fall, Margaret had been quietly moving joint marital assets into accounts only Lachlan controlled. She had been preparing the financial side of the divorce before it had ever officially begun. Before the push. Before I had any reason to suspect what was being quietly arranged around me. Claire laid both paths out on the table and asked me plainly how far I was prepared to go. I looked at the 2 options in front of me. Then I looked at her, and I said, all the way. She did not look surprised at all. She simply nodded, opened a brand new file folder, wrote my name carefully at the top of the first page, and began. Dennis Webb had worked for the Hargrove family for 11 long years. He had left the role quietly 8 months after my fall and had taken copies of what he considered relevant documents before he went. He was not acting out of revenge. He was a man who had watched something happen that he could not keep carrying. His records showed a clear and patient pattern. In the 6 weeks before I fell, money had been moving. Shared assets were being quietly redirected into accounts that Lachlan held alone. A property valuation had been altered on paper. An investment account I had been named on was restructured without my knowledge or signature. The work was careful and deliberate, the kind that only gets done by someone planning well in advance. The push had not been a moment of rage. It had been the final step in a plan that had begun weeks before. Margaret had prepared the financial exit first. Then she had arranged the physical one. I sat with that truth for a long time after Claire explained it. Then I asked her to add Dennis's documents to the file and told her I was ready to move forward. The court documents were filed on a Wednesday morning. By law, they immediately became public record. By Thursday morning, a journalist had found the Hargrove name inside the filing. By Thursday afternoon, the headline named Margaret directly. It used words like premeditated, civil assault, and financial fraud all in the opening paragraph. The same Melbourne social circles that had passed around Margaret's version 4 years earlier were now reading a completely different story. Former friends who had gone cold on me began sending carefully worded messages. 11 of them arrived in 2 days, all from people who had sat at the same charity lunches where Margaret had performed her grief so convincingly for years and years. I read every single message. I replied to very few of them. The Hargrove PR team released a statement within 24 hours describing the claims as vindictive and baseless, saying the family was deeply and genuinely saddened by what they called a calculated financial attack on a grieving household. Claire printed the statement the very moment it appeared and added it without comment to a second file she had been carefully building for several weeks. She had already chosen a name for that second file. She called it defamation. Margaret hired a crisis PR consultant who immediately began placing stories in Melbourne's gossip and social media networks. The stories described me as bitter and emotionally unstable. They said Pippa's declaration had been fabricated entirely by a troubled young woman trying to damage her own family. One lifestyle column described my daughter's death as a disputed incident that both parties recall in different ways. I read that line at my desk at Pinnacle. I read it twice, and then once more very slowly. Then I opened a new folder on my laptop and named it Margaret's Gifts. Every false story, every planted article, every traceable post from the consultant's network went into that folder. Documented. Timestamped. Sent directly to Claire each time one appeared anywhere online. Claire told me this was exactly the right thing to be doing, and that it mattered. Every lie Margaret paid to circulate publicly was adding another strong count of defamation to the case building steadily in the background. Margaret was fighting the hardest she had ever fought because she was now completely cornered. Cornered people always make the most mistakes. I kept my head down and let her keep going and kept the folder growing. Pinnacle's report had done its quiet and thorough work throughout Melbourne's financial community. With the acquisition rejected and the full analysis circulating among investment firms, no serious organization was willing to work with the Hargrove Group any longer. Their credit line reached its full limit, and the bank declined to extend it by a single dollar. 2 subsidiaries shut down completely. The Toorak headquarters, the glass building that had appeared on every Hargrove family Christmas card for over a decade, was listed as loan collateral against their outstanding debt. The cars began leaving the estate driveway one by one. First, the Range Rover. Then the black Mercedes Margaret had driven to every social function for 10 years. Then a third vehicle Pippa later told me had been Lachlan's personal car. Margaret stopped attending Melbourne's social functions entirely. 1 absence at first, then 2, then a full month without appearing at any of the clubs, lunches, or charity boards she had chaired for 30 years. People in those circles noticed immediately. They always do. The silence where a familiar face used to stand is its own kind of public announcement. I did not feel triumph. I simply kept my focus on what was still ahead. Brittany Caldwell read the court documents carefully. The full filing was public record, and she went through it thoroughly. She found the key timeline at page 7. The dates showed clearly that Lachlan had first met Brittany at a Caldwell family function 6 weeks before his divorce from me was finalized. 6 weeks before, while I was still legally his wife. While the papers were being prepared and the assets were being quietly redirected away from me. She confronted him the evening she finished reading. Pippa was in the house and heard the conversation from the hallway. Brittany asked whether he had known her before the marriage officially ended. He did not deny the dates. Then she asked one more question in a quiet and steady voice. She asked whether his mother had pushed me. Lachlan said nothing. He sat in the silence for 5 full seconds. And Brittany picked up her phone from the table and walked out of the room without another word. She called her father from the driveway. Within 48 hours, the Caldwell family had withdrawn all connection from the Hargroves. Brittany had moved her things to her parents' house by the end of the week. Lachlan's father, Robert Hargrove, had always been the background figure. He attended functions and managed appearances and smiled in the right photographs. Margaret ran everything and Robert let her, year after year, decade after decade. He was a man who had chosen the comfort of not looking closely over the discomfort of actually seeing. He read the court documents alone in his study, with the door fully closed. Then he called a family meeting without telling Margaret what it concerned. When she walked into the sitting room and saw the printed pages on the coffee table, she understood immediately. Robert looked at his wife for a long moment. Then he asked her quietly and directly whether she had pushed me. The room went completely still. Pippa stood near the door. Lachlan sat on the far couch. Margaret looked at her husband and said absolutely nothing. Not a denial. Not a single word of explanation. Just silence sitting in the room, like something solid that no one could move around. Robert looked at that silence for a moment. Then he picked up his jacket and walked out of the room. The front door closed. That was the last night Robert slept at the estate. Margaret's legal team made their offer on a Friday afternoon. Significant financial compensation, a private written apology, and a full non-disclosure agreement. The NDA was 10 pages long and covered every detail. The fall, the divorce, the asset transfers, all public statements across 4 years. In plain terms, in exchange for money, I would agree to stay silent for the rest of my life about everything that had been done to me. Claire called me after receiving it and read the key terms aloud over the phone. Then she waited. I asked one question. Was the compensation substantial enough to reflect what had actually been taken from me? She said yes, more than substantial. I thought about it for exactly 1 full day. Then I sent my counter through Claire. One single condition. I would accept the money and the written acknowledgement of harm. But there would be no NDA. No silence clause of any kind. What Margaret Hargrove had done would not be buried under my signature. Margaret's team rejected the counter immediately.
Claire said, "Court it is."
She began preparing the full hearing schedule that same afternoon. 48 hours later, Margaret's lawyers called back. She accepted my terms. The settlement was signed on a Tuesday morning. Claire walked me through every single page without rushing. The compensation was transferred. The formal written acknowledgement of harm was attached, stamped, and dated. It named what had happened without careful language or softened phrases. It said what it was plainly. There was no NDA, no silence clause, no condition that required me to hold my tongue in exchange for justice. Everything Margaret Hargrove had done remained mine to speak about freely if I ever chose to. Claire placed the final page in front of me, and I signed my name. Then she looked up and said, "You won, Sienna." I looked at the documents on the table in front of me. I thought about the marble staircase and the ambulance and the hospital bed. I thought about the envelope beside the water cup and the folder named evidence and the late night studying. I thought about Pippa's hands sliding a sealed envelope across a small cafe table. I thought about Victoria offering me a role because she remembered a paper I wrote at 22. I looked at Claire and said, "Not yet, but close." She raised one eyebrow. I smiled, and I meant it completely. They came one by one. Pippa arrived first. She sat at my table and said she was sorry it took so long. I told her she came eventually, and that was enough. Robert came next, formal and ashamed. He said he should have protected me. I told him he was right. I poured tea, and we sat without pretending. Brittany came on a Thursday. She did not apologize for Lachlan. She apologized for accepting a story without asking a question. I told her I understood. She nodded and left. Lachlan came on a Sunday with no lawyers. He said he knew what he had done and what he had not done. He said standing at the top of those stairs saying nothing was something he would carry forever. I said, "I know, Lachlan." I closed the door quietly. Without anger. Margaret never came. A letter arrived through solicitors instead. Cold and legal and nothing beyond what the settlement required. I placed it in a box beside the divorce papers and closed the wardrobe. Victoria offered me a senior partner track at Pinnacle. I accepted. I finished my master's degree with distinction. I moved into a South Yarra apartment I chose for myself. The life on this side of the pane is entirely, completely, and beautifully mine.